The Ironies of Indian Maoism by Jairus Banaji from the International Socialism 2, 128, marked up by Eend O'Callaghan. Editor's note: a spectre is haunting South Asia, the spectre of Maoism. The Financial Times rather melodramatically announced in April 2006, reporting that the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had described Maoist guerrillas as the single greatest threat to Indian national security. The scale of the Maoist-led insurgency in rural India had surprised and alarmed ruling classes for whom Marxism-Leninism was supposed to have been safely confined to the dustbin of history after 1989. The Indian Maoists, who have also become a subject of discussion on the left, both in India and internationally, in particular, a recent article by writer and campaigner Arundhati Roy described her visit to Maoist-controlled area attracted much controversy. I'll make a comment here. I'm probably going to mispronounce every single name in this entire document, just so you know. In the following piece, the Indian Marxist scholar and activist Jairus Banaji offers a much more critical analysis of Indian Maoism than Roy provided. But first, here's a little background to help the reader unfamiliar with Indian politics and society. See also the glossary. India is by far the most important country in the world where communism remains a powerful political force. Reflecting the twists and turns of Moscow's foreign policy, the Communist Party of India, the CPI, during the struggle for national liberation from Britain, had an ambivalent relationship to the dominant nationalist party, the Indian National Congress, but its role in different social movements gave it a significant popular base. After independence was won in 1947, Congress-ruled India pursued a policy of neutrality in the Cold War that led to a strategic partnership with the Soviet Union. Moscow's demands that the CPI moderate its opposition to Congress caused increasing tension within the party. These were exacerbated by the split in 1960 between the USSR and China under Mao Zedong, who denounced the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. The rise of Maoism, purporting to offer a more radical version of Marxist-Leninism than Moscow, divided the international communist movement. Nowhere is this more true than in India. The 1962 border war between India and China deepened the division within the CPI, and in 1964, the pro-China faction broke away to form the Communist Party of India Marxist, or CPIM. The new party's rhetoric was much more radical than the CPI's, and indeed it remained strongly Marxist-Leninist, not to say Stalinist, but in practice the CPIM had pursued the same kind of parliamentary strategy that the Moscow CPI also continues to follow. This has brought the CPIM a significant degree of success in bourgeois politics, particularly at the level of state government. India has a quasi-federal political system in which the states have significant powers. Today, the CPIM is the largest left party in India, dominating the state's government of West Bengal, Kerala, and Tripura. But the gap between rhetoric and practice has grown. As these governments implement neoliberal policies that have caused internal conflicts within the party, as well as clashes with popular movements. It was the same gap that gave rise to Indian Maoism proper in the late 1960s. At the time when the Chinese Cultural Revolution was inspiring young radicals everywhere, the CPIM itself split as Shahrukh, Mazumdar, and other local leaders in West Bengal placed themselves at the head of a rising in the Naxal Bari district. Banaji's article traces the subsequent development of the Indian Maoist. It is worth underlining that, as he notes, they continue to operate within an ideological framework that, in common with the more mainstream communist parties, treats India as a feudal or semi-feudal society. But that follows Mao in treating the peasantry as the key revolutionary force. In fact, India is a thoroughly capitalist society, though one shaped by the process of uneven and combined development that Neil Davidson discusses elsewhere in this issue. A large proportion of the rural poor in India consists of workers drawn from so-called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. That is, those who have traditionally been at the bottom of the caste hierarchy or beyond its pale and subject to centuries of domination. Today, the scheduled caste are generally referred to as Dalits, with the general sense of the crushed or oppressed, and the tribes known as Adivasis as a term that highlights their character as the original inhabitants of the subcontinent. The bulk of the scheduled caste are agricultural laborers. They have worked traditionally as farm servants and casual laborers for a substantial peasantry, drawn from the upper caste and so-called other backwards classes, OBCs. In Andhra Pradesh, where the Naxalites sank deep roots in the 1970s, over 70% of Dalits are landless laborers. With the Great Awakening that swept through the masses for much of the 20th century, large parts of rural and small-town India saw a proto-slavery rebellion of sorts. By the late 1970s, and a dramatic increase in the number of caste atrocities, that is, murderous assaults on Dalits, their families, and their settlements. For their part, Adivasis make up a little under 10% of the country's population, some 84 million at the last count, with the bulk of them concentrated in the central Indian state of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, and Andhra Pradesh. The Santals in eastern India and the Gonds of central India are among the largest groups numerically, and both have figured prominently in the Maoist movement. The Adivasis are mostly forest dwellers and migrant workers. The vast majority of them sunk in abject poverty, whose chief causes have been expanding state control of the forest and the encroachment of non-tribals. But the last 2 decades have seen strong tribal resistance to the expansion of mining capital as the reopening of India to the world economy increased competition among both Indian states and industrial capitals, and encouraged a quite scandalous exploitation of non-renewable resources and the resource-rich tribal belts of Orissa, Chhattisgarh, and Jharkhand that remain among the most impoverished parts of the country. The picture is one of unabated ecological depletion, which includes a rampant growth of illegal mining and the widespread use of open-cast mining techniques, and a continued displacement of tribals. Elsewhere, in the countryside, millions of agricultural laborers from the Dalit and other communities face the grim prospects of growing joblessness and land hunger, because the central government is unwilling to risk the kind of confrontation with state legislatures and that any substantial attack on these issues will inevitably bring. AC. A rough periodization of the Maoist movement in India might read as follows. 1. The seminal years of Naxalism, from the late 1960s to the end of 1972, were defined by a split from the Communist Party of India, Marxist, CPIM, in 1967, when a large-scale exodus began and the mass upsurge in various parts of West Bengal, and largely tribal-dominated districts, and in Srikakulam among the Andhra coast. Construed by the split-away Marxist-Leninists as uprisings of the peasantry and struggles for state power. 2. A period from the main part of the 1970s to the 1980s, when the movement reassembled itself outside Bengal, chiefly in central and southern Bihar and in Telangana regions of Andhra Pradesh. Here, 2 major armed struggles tendencies survived with substantial continuity through the whole of the 1970s. The Chandrapula Reddy group and a group of Kondapalli Sitharamaya. 3. A dramatic escalation of conflict from 1985 that will lead eventually to a wholesale militarization of the movement in the 1990s and to the civil war that is currently raging in the tribal heartlands of their formerly undivided district of Bastar and the state of Chhattisgarh. If the party launched by Charu Mazumdar in 1969 had disintegrated by 1971, and fragmentation remained a characteristic of the Maoist groups throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the most recent phase has seen a series of mergers and a more consolidated majority movement. Today, the 2 major currents of Indian Naxalism are the CPI, Marxist-Leninist Liberation, which is a more or less open party that has contested elections since the late 1970s, and the CPI Maoists, which is waging the guerrilla war in Bastar and parts of Orissa. When the Indian government describes Maoism as the country's biggest internal security threat, it is referring not to all the various Maoist parties, which are still numerous, but specifically to the CPI Maoists, which emerged in 2004 as a merger between People's War and the Maoist Communist Centre of India, MCCI. People's War was itself the outcome of a merger between the People's War group, founded by Sitharamaiah, and a Bihar-based party, Party Unity. Unlike Liberation, the People's War group had been banned on and off for most of its history, and so of course it is its avatar, the CPI Maoist. Andhra Pradesh had always been the true backbone of Indian Maoism. It was the only state in the country where the Maoists were a majority in mid-1967, when a series of state-led coordination committees revolted against the CPIM leadership, egged on by the Chinese Communist Party's call for a fight against revisionism. The party lost 60% of its membership in the state, with Nagi Reddy carrying 11 of the 14 districts committees with him. But Andhra Maoists stayed out of the All India Coordination Committee of Revolutionaries in November 1967, when the dissidents either left or were forced out of the CPIM. The coordination of state committees renamed itself the All India Coordination Committee of Communist Revolutionaries by the middle of the 1968. It had more or less committed itself to forming a separate party. Yet, as Mohan Ram wrote, there was intense confusion in the AICCR about the priorities towards building a party and about the kind of party to be built. From Charu Mazumdar, the primary condition for building such a party was to organize armed struggle in the countryside. The major task of revolutionaries was to plunge into work among the peasant masses, set up revolutionary bases. Mazumdar had nothing to say about the role of mass organizations, and the accent was on a secret party. The division within the AICCR were essentially on the issue of mass work and whether a party formed in this way, with middle-class youth being sent out to rouse the peasant masses in the countryside to wage guerrilla war and build rural base areas, will be in a position to sustain armed struggle. Brushing these differences aside, the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, or CPI-ML, was formed on 22 April 1968 and launched at a May Day gathering that year. It had more or less disintegrated by 1971, with a section led by Bihar's Satya Narayan Singh dissociating itself from Mazumdar. Singh, or SNS as he was called, had described Mazumdar's line as individual terrorism as early as July 1970. By November that year, a majority of the CPI-ML's 21 members Central Committee withdrew support from Mazumdar, and he was expelled from the party in 1971. The CCP had come down heavily on Mazumdar, denouncing his conception of annihilation as secret assassination, claiming he had no agrarian program, and described his policy as wrong. Most substantially, it argued, without mass struggle and mass organization, the peasants' armed struggle cannot be sustained. Regarding the formulation that if a revolutionary does not make his hands red with blood of class enemies, then he is not a communist. If this is to be the yardstick of a communist, then that communist party cannot remain a communist party. Top leaders like Kanyu Sanyal, in jail by 1972, referred to their great disappointment, regret, and disgust at the fact that Mazumdar had refused to learn any lessons from the valuable suggestions of the CCP. Class roots of revolt. Naxal Bari, in the northwest of Bengal, became a template for the Indian Revolution and gave the Naxalites their name. But there was no serious attempt by the Maoist leadership to look at the nature of the struggles there, or in Midnapur, Medinipur, or Srikakulam, or Kondamodalu. For example, Dukert notes that in the Santhal inhabited areas of Debra and Gopibalavapur in Midnapur, the Naxalites succeeded in mobilizing large numbers of landless laborers and sharecroppers. There was widespread landlessness among the Santals in the districts like Midnapur and Birbhum, and it was essential ultimately these landless tribals who formed the backbone of the mass agitations that the new party led in 1969. In harvesting campaigns that Mazumdar himself was opposed to, the rural upsurges in Midnapore and Bibum coincide with the monsoons, when the landless could at least expect to gain work. In Naxalbari, in the Siliguri division of Darjeeling in the north, the land occupied that mushroomed between March and May 1967 involved Santal tea garden laborers who worked as sharecroppers on the excess land of the estate. The local leadership here, Kanu Sanyo and Jangal Santal, did not subscribe to the strategy of small squad actions and concentrated on mass agitation. The agriculture, on issues like eviction of sharecroppers and recovery of excess lands, was given the character of a nascent insurgency because the Santals were armed with bows and arrows and remained poised for attack on police parties. As the CPIM-led United Front government decided to break the movement, with large-scale arrests, and hundreds of tribals fled to the forests, where they ill-formed, armed, and experienced guerrilla units besieged by a massive police force. By August, wholesale surrender began to take place. The government had succeeded in breaking the movement by force. In the Srikakulam agency area, the bulk of Adivais, or Girijans as they were called here, were agricultural laborers. Andhra Pradesh accounts for the highest incidence of tribal land alienation in the country, with non-tribals owning more than half the land in the scheduled areas. Thus here, landlessness stemmed from a widespread process of dispossession that had occurred on a large scale in the coastal tracts of Antara, where primitive accumulation by the state and by moneylenders involved in suppression of customary rights like Podu and the appropriation of large tracts of land, either state forests or land seized by non-tribals. In Srikakulam, the communists had built a broad-based organization of tribals by the late 1950s, and the land occupation and crop seizures that exploded in 1968 were directed as much against those forces as against any abstract feudalism. In Kondamadalu and East Godavari, the first demand was taken up by the party, concerned with the indebtedness of the tribals and their exploitation by the moneylenders. But the issue on which the movement really picked up was farm wages. Here, the land seizures of 1969 targeted lands that had been alienated to the non-tribals or mortgaged to the moneylenders and did not include the self-cultivated lands of the landlords over which the tribals as yet felt they had no claim. The movement in Srikakulam was crushed by the middle of 1970 and appeared to decline set in. Mazumdar died in custody in July 1972. On one estimate, by March 1973, there was some 17,787 Naxalite prisoners in West Bengal alone. Shock attacks on the class enemy has had disastrous results. In Adara, Nagi Reddy's group, the Andhra Pradesh Revolutionary Communist Committee, APRCC, argued, some persons forming themselves into groups and without any relation to the mass movement attacked the landlords and other exploiters. We want to make clear that these attacks carried on without any relation to the mass revolution movement cannot enable us to dissolve feudalism. Annihilations would not annihilate the system or forms of exploitation. The CPI-ML's methodology made the people feel that someone else and not they were the liberators. The setback was so severe that the CPI-ML fragmented rapidly and was badly divided in the months leading to the state of emergency declared by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in June 1975. During the emergency in 1977, some 10 Maoist groups were banned and an estimated 40 cadres were in jail. But within the Maoist mainstream, the disintegration of the Central Committee spawned repeated attempts at reunification. Nagi Reddy, who had been opposed to the formation of a centralized party and had repeatedly emphasized the need for a longish period of mass work, teamed up with Parimal Das Gupta, one of Mazumdar's earliest critics, and others nationally to form the Unity Center of Communist Revolutionaries of India, Marxist-Leninist. This more or less disintegrated when Nagi Reddy died in 1975. In Andhra itself, Nagi Reddy's group was the weakest of these three groups that existed there in the 1970s. The Andhra Pradesh Revolutionary Communist Party, led by Chandrapula Reddy, the strongest group in the state in the 1970s, defended the armed defense of the cadres in the face of repression, but combined with this mass struggle, or at least the need for an active mobilization of the masses. Despite this, C.P. Reddy supported SNS's drive to regroup the CPI-ML and was part of the Provisional Central Committee, till he split in 1980. Thus, the C.P. Reddy group absorbed very different sorts of influences. It would abandon the boycottism of the CPI-ML and start contesting elections from 1978, even winning a seat in the Andhra Assembly elections. It was also the C.P. Reddy groups that was first active in forming the Rayothu Kuli Sanghams, or agricultural labor unions. These spread rapidly in the late 1970s and were a key factor in creating substantial popular support for the Naxals in Andhra. The third Maoist group in Andhra was in some ways the most orthodox, since its leader Kondapalli Sithamaya had joined the AICCR early in 1969, and when the Central Committee disintegrated, Sitharamaya was the Andhra face of the Pro-Sharu Central Organizing Committee. These common coordinations meant little in practice, since the Andhra Maoists were largely independent in their evolution. In the general retreat and disintegration of the CPI-ML that dominated the early 1970s, both C.P. Reddy and the Andhra CLC retained the elements of a squad organizing in North Telangana, and again, the issues were less those of peasantry than of a purely landless and scheduled caste. Laborers and farm servants in districts like Karimnagar, and of tribals and other working people in the Godavari Valley region. Unlike the insane Pushism that had controlled and destroyed the party under Mazumdar's leadership, Telangana in the late 1970s and early 1980s saw major developments that laid the groundwork for the People's War of the 1990s and 2000s. The PWG, formed in 1980, had substantial control of Telangana by the end of the 1980s, and it is crucial to see why. The reason, as the late human activist K. Balagopal explained, was that unlike the rest of Andhra, where the Naxalites spread through the armed squads in northern Telangana, there was a clear period in the 1970s and early 1980s, when it was the mass organization, mainly the agricultural laborers associated in the student youth fronts, that were the instrument for the spread of Maoism as an ideology and a political practice. That phase was soon to pass, and the people would start depending on the armed squads for justice. But Sitharamaya, who attracted the younger generation to his group in large numbers, saw no conflict between the mass organizations and armed struggle. And their combined impact was to strike fatally at the power relations of rural Telangana society and endow the poor, the Dalits, and the tribals with a voice of their own and the courage to speak out. For all the violence they unleashed their own, and even worse, more widely spread violence to the state in Andhra, it was possible for Balagopal to maintain that there is fear that if the Naxalites go away, the poor cannot survive. If the PWG emerged as the dominant group in Andhra, even more so when the C.P. Reddy group split off in 1984, in Bihar, the field was equally divided between liberation, party unity, and the Maoist Communist Center. A key factor in the survival of the PWG was the expansion into the largely tribal districts of Telangana, where the cadre encouraged tribals to cut down and cultivate reserved forests, forced a substantial increase in the wages paid by the Tendu leaf contractors, and put an end to the harassment Adivasis suffered at the hands of the forest officials and the police. In Bihar, the oppression of the rural poor took a different form. Though called zamindars by the laborers, the Bhuminhars of the district like Bhojpur were in fact substantial peasantry, kisans, and the suppression of the rural poor was as much a struggle for dignity, izzat, that is for freedom from violence and caste oppression, as a struggle over wages and land rights. The violent colonial repression of the military labor markets of northern India had done very little to modify the warrior ethos of zamindars and peasants alike, and states like Bihar and the Dalits, who formed the bulk of the laborers, Mazdurs, knew that any open challenge to upper and middle caste domination would eventually and inevitably result in armed violence. One student claimed that in the village he studied, most Dalits wanted the Maoist armed squads to remain in the area as they feared that the landowners would re-establish their dominance if the Maoists withdrew. Another was told that because we have arms, the Zamindars had shrunk with fear. Thus, all of the main Bihar groups were committed to armed struggle, to one degree or another. The Naxalites, who were brought into Bhojpur in the late 1960s, would later split from the CPI-ML, pro-Mazumdar, pro-Lin Piao faction, led by Mahadeb Mukherjee, without gravitating to SN Singh's Central Committee at the other end of the pro-anti-Mazumdar spectrum. Liberation was the outcome of the new Central Committee formed in July 1974 by Subroto Datta alias Jawar, the young leader of the Third Tendency, and one of three Bihar parties was the one that showed the most substantial evolution in terms of seeking strategies for both survival and growth. In an extraordinary combination of legal and illegal work, Liberation floated in a front group organization, the Indian People's Front, IPF, that contested 50 seats in the Bihar Assembly election in 1985, even as its armed squad pulled over 60 annihilations between 1980 and 1984. Much of this violence was part of the titanic struggle of the Bihar groups were engaged in against the caste-based private militias formed by the Bhumihars, Kurmis, and other landed castes in their drive to exterminate Naxalism from the plains of Bihar. This warfare dominated the whole of the 1980s and much of the 1990s. While the CPI-ML was successful in fighting the smaller militias, it was drawn inexorably into a caste dynamic that shaped the nature of the movement and its struggles. Party Unity formed in 1982 successfully fought the Bhumi Sena in Jinnabad, but by the 1990s it drew much of its support from the Kurmis and its Dalit supporters, all of them workers. Felt deserted and betrayed. The MCC, which had evolved from the Dakshin Desh, one of Maoist groups that stayed out of the AICCCR and eventually built its base in Jharkhand, then South Bihar, had a large following among Yadavs and became deeply embroiled in caste vendettas that involved horrific massacres on all sides. The MCC had no interest in open organizations of any sort. Party Unity style of politics effectively drove its one open front, the Mazdoor Kisan Sangram Samiti underground. It was banned in 1986, and Liberation had to disband the IPF in 1994, where its popularity was actually a threat to the identity of the party. Finally, not least, the problems with the total absorption in left-wing militarism, less true of Liberation, which seems to have dismantled its squads by late 1990s, have been the armed clashes between the various Naxal groups, involving the liquidation of each other's cadres. Militarization of the struggle. The late 1980s saw a dramatic escalation of conflict once the PWG took the fateful decision to target the state directly by mounting attacks on the police, inaugurating a spiral of violence that is not abated till today. It was in July 1984 that the first incident of deliberate murder of a policeman by the Naxalites took place. That was in Jagtiao, a disturbed area of Karimnagar, where the police, in collusion with armed BJP landlords, had been subjecting Naxal youth to repeated and savage torture. Balagopal himself referred to these escalating levels of violence as a new phase. They would transform the conflict into a full-scale war, with sizable paramilitary forces converted Telangana and the adjoining forest areas into a vast police camp, and with a profound militarization of the PWG itself. By the 1980s, whole tribal hamlets were set on fire to teach them a lesson not to harbor Naxalites. By 1997, Balagopal could write that the 1990s has seen an unprecedented escalation in the magnitude of the killings. More than 60% of encounters killing of the last 3 decades had taken place in the last 6 years. Since then, over the period 1997 to 2007, the Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee had recorded roughly 1,800 encountered killings by the police. It is crucial to note that the vast majority of the victims of these extrajudicial killings of the Dalits are Jalits and tribals, many of them with no direct connection to the Naxalites. The culture of impunity extended to the police establishment by the two dominant parties in the state had left a pall of fear hanging over large parts of Telangana, and the thought has driven the PWG into the forest of Bastar and the border districts of Orissa, spawning the delusion that Andhra had solved its Naxalite problem. The sheer incoherence of the state's strategy, repeated banning of the PWG, repeated legalizing and unmitigated repressions had left the legacy of substantial underlying support for the CPI Maoists, or former PWG leaders, and Andhra itself. For the radical left, the key issues is whether the armed struggle that has now been displaced to the adjoined districts in Chhattisgarh and Orissa is truly the form of a movement for a socialist emancipation, and the kind of political culture it wants and sees as viable in a country as vast and complex as India. Before coming to this, we should look briefly at the latest phase of the conflict. Bastar is today the front line of the explosive Naxal battle that is retailed to millions of households in India through the news channel. PWG's expansion in Bastar and Gadacharial began in the early 1990s, fleeing early waves of repression in Andhra, and by 1989 the party felt strong enough to form a mass peasant front called the Dandakarnya Adivasai Kisan Mazdoor Sangatana, backed by a series of armed squads that contained something under 200 cadres. These expanded rapidly in the early 1990s, a period where Sithamaya was hounded out of the party and a new younger leadership consolidated its hold. In fact, the 1990s threw up an explosive conjuncture, as state governments had began dreaming of the fabulous sums of money to be made from the mineral-rich tribal districts they had abandoned to decades of oppression and misery. The PWG rapidly militarized itself, with major increases in lethality, vastly more sophisticated weaponry, including extensive use of landmines, an elaborate organization of platoons, battalions, and military commands, and new expansions in the tribal districts of southern Orissa. By 2001, the party, now called People's War, decided to intensify the war in 10 states. In 2004, PW and MCC emerged to form the CPI Maoists. With police forces too demoralized to handle the insurgency, the Chhattisgarh, the BJP government secretly funded and armed a private lynch mob called Salwa Jadum, or Purification Hunt in Gondi, that had since emptied hundreds of villagers by forcing inhabitants into internally displaced persons camps, where they can be easily controlled. Large swaths of Dantewara are now abandoned. Villages in Salwa Jadum controlled areas that refuse to cooperate are deemed Maoist villages and are then attacked. On one count, some 40,000 tribals had been herded in these camps, and others had fled deep into the forest or border into Kaman. Meanwhile, in the last year, the Maoists have inflicted major losses on the CPRF, the official military operation in Chhattisgarh, forcing the central government to take control of counterinsurgency operations. The wholesale militarization of the movement since the 1990s had culminated in a vanguard war trapped in an expanding culture of counterinsurgency, with tens of thousands of civilians caught between them. The Critique of Arms. In 2006, K. Balagapal wrote, "Nothing justifies the tendency, in democratic circles, to talk as if all that is relevant for understanding the role of the Maoists in the area, Bastar region and Dantewara in particular, is the poverty and general backwardness of the tribals living there." What he meant by this was that ultimately the kind of militarized Maoism that has emerged in India would have to stand or fall in terms of a critique from the left itself. The dispossession and oppression of tribals and the redoubled drive to open the districts to exploitation by large industrial capital, with the displacement and impoverishment this causes, have been major sources of the tendency of Maoism in India, a movement to which tribal support has always been crucial. But it was pure naivety to reduce one to the other, or to identify the tribes in the Maoists as if their agendas were the same, or the victory of one would mean the emancipation of the other. Responses, critical or otherwise, from the left can be classified broadly into four categories. Maoists and Maoist sympathizers abstract from the profound deformities of the movement to engage in solidarity with it at any cost. They posit an almost mystical identity between the Maoists and the people, and do precisely what Balagapal advised democratic circles not to do, namely use the poverty and general backwardness of the tribal areas as an excuse for not engaging with the CPI Maoists politically. A second line response has been the CPI Marxists' savage repression of all popular movements that challenge their own agenda for the state of West Bengal, using the machinery state to crush both the Maoists and much wider layers of the population, again largely tribal, they see as sympathizing with them or opposing their own policies. Thus, whereas the CPI Maoists sabotaged the struggle, like the one in Lagom, by infiltrating the People's Committee agent against police atrocities and eliminating all political rivals, the CPI Marxists fell back on its own vigilant group and on state counterinsurgency forces to quell the movement there. Both parties, and large parts of the state apparatus of course, have an interest in branding what began as was for months a democratic popular upsurge as Maoist, and of course two Marxist parties have been slaughtering each other's cadres. Sharply different from both the above have been civil liberties critique that was largely represented in the writings of the late Balagapol through most of the 1990s down to his death in 2009. Balagapol's critique recorded features that displayed an unmitigated authoritarianism on the part of a movement he had been closely associated with, features he saw when undermining its sources of support. He referred to the ruthlessness of the party, the PWG, that had evolved by the early 1990s, to the calculated use of terror as a political instrument, the medieval forms of violence that characterized the so-called people's courts, the lack of a possibility on any opposition to the party, so long as the police are taken care of, the new culture that had permeated the Naxalite organizations as they recruited large numbers of new cadres, more attracted by its weapons than its politics, and the recognizable deterioration of quality this has brought with it. More substantially, he saw the movement in Andhra culminating in stagnation by the 2000s and forced to sidestep the crisis by expanding into new territory, failing to consolidate a second generation of support. And finally, there were clear elements of a critique of the substitutionism of a vanguard struggle, where most decisions were taken to implement over the heads of the people, but justified in the names of the people. A politics that had simply corrupted the masses into receivers of justice rather than fighters of it. There are among the most political criticisms that have been made of obsessively violent forms. Maoism has come to take, and they're profoundly more significant for any further left movement in India than any uncritical solidarity of fellow travelers. The imminent indiscriminate killing of village headmen, the widespread laying of landmines, and the recruitment of miners, the sabotage of all means of communication, the ban on employment-generating public works have all started to drive a wedge between the party and its tribal sympathizers precisely in the liberated zones. A fourth set of responses would have to come from the Marxists who have never identified with any of the Stalinist political traditions in India and do not see revolutionary movement developing in a class vacuum, a complete isolation from industrial workers and more organized groups of wage earners and employees in the economy at large. The bulk of Indian labor force remains unorganized into unions, and it's stupefying to imagine that a revolution against capitalism can succeed while the mass of the workers are in a state of near complete atomization. The impoverished notions of democracy that either reduce it to a battle for electoral supremacy or dismiss it as a fraud, the failure to encourage and develop a culture of working-class organizations and debate, to encourage forms of intervention that can test capitalism in concrete ways and build a movement that can address the widest possible range of issues, starting from the desperate struggle for survival of the millions of landless in India, are all part of the legacy of a left that was moribund intellectually and deeply conservative in its culture. Shankar Guha Niyogi, murdered in 1991, and A.K. Roy of the Marxist Coordination Committee, expelled from the CPIM in 1973, both charismatic union leaders, stood in sharp contrast to that political tradition. They drew their popular support precisely from the landless tribals employed in the iron ore and coal mines in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. The CPI Maoist conception of the working class is a rhetorical one, since it is the party that embodies the leadership of the class and conducts the class struggle on its behalf, unelected, unaccountable, and never subject to recall. This has been a consistent feature of the Naxalite group since the 1960s. Second, the Maoist grasp of the theory is unbelievably primitive, a collage of abstractions that bear little relation to reality at any level, analysis, or strategy. Semi-feudalism, comprador bourgeoisie, four-class alliance, protracted people's war, etc. are all slavishly copies from Mao's theorizations from China that will soon be almost a century old. For example, the leader of Liberation defends the label comprador bourgeois by saying it refers to the increasing organic integration between Indian big businesses and imperialist capital, but organic integration between capitals across national boundaries is precisely what defines capitalism, unless one is going to see the latter as an aggregation of national economies. Third, even the mass organizations fail to be truly democratic as long as they're controlled by a secretive and hierarchical party. Yet parties like the CPI Maoists require secrecy not just from the state, but also to penetrate democratic mass movements to gain control of them. As Santosh Rana shows for Langa, and finally, the Marxist critique will have to be able to absorb the civil liberties one, not simply ignore it. As Balagopal's colleague, Andhra, most distinguished civil rights lawyer, noted years ago, no political movement working for the overflow of an exploitative order has any right to reproduce the brutalities practiced by that order.